Peacebuilding Institute Public Forum 2023. It is both a privilege and a blessing to have you here this morning. I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker this morning and all those who will be providing a response to the keynote address this morning. Welcome to the other guests, colleagues and friends who have joined us in this public forum. And a very special welcome to the MPI family, who in the last week have journeyed together in the annual Peacebuilding training program. For those of you who have attended MPI in the previous years, the public forum is a special feature of the annual Peacebuilding training program and is held usually on the Saturday of the first week of the training. And it is an opportunity for MPI participants and those of our colleagues and friends who have come in to join us in the public forum to share their space and to dialogue on critical issues that affect all of us as peace builders who come from different corners of the world and join in the annual Peacebuilding training program every year. With the overall theme for MPI's 2023 annual Peacebuilding training being forging the path towards peace, the journey continues. This public forum that will focus on the critical issues peace builders are facing in Asia, the Pacific, and likewise in many other regions of the world. In this past week, many stories have been told in the different classes, and you can attest to that. And they are stories of breakthroughs, of successes, of achievements, and resilience. But they are also stories of pain, woundedness, struggles, and sufferings caused by conflict and violence in Asia, the Pacific, and many other parts of the world. So it is the story of many of us who are seated in this public forum. But it's also the story of the communities that we represent in this public forum. So it's the story of many of us who are here, and the stories of those that we've left behind to come forward to engage in this public forum and in this training this week. I'd like to, before I get to move on to introduce the speakers today, I think you all have a copy of the program, and I'd just like to go through very briefly the program for today. So we will begin immediately after this with a keynote address. And then after the keynote address, we have 3 of MPI participants 2023 who will respond to the keynote address. And then afterwards, we will come back to provide a space where you can ask your questions to the keynote speaker this morning, but also to those who are giving a response to the keynote address. And so at this juncture, I would like to introduce the guest speaker this morning. And our guest speaker is not new to MPI. He is an alumni of, no? Okay, not yet, but he is connected to the work that we do at MPI, and is a friend and a colleague to many of us who are at MPI. So he is Marc Batac. He is a peace builder, he's an organizer, he's a facilitator, he's a researcher, and social features designer based in the Philippines. He is affiliated with various organizations, such as the Initiatives for International Dialogue, the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, the Generation Peace Youth Network, the Security Policy Alternatives Network, and Civic Futures, among others. He was one of the key organizers behind the 2013 Million People March and the 2017 to 2018 Block Marcos movement protest against the burial of dictator Marcos in the Heroes Cemetery. Immediately after the attempted coup in Myanmar in 2021, he co-founded the Militarian Alliance, Friends of Myanmar, to rally behind solidarity and support from democracy and peace activists across Asia and beyond. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Batac, who will speak to us about the issues that face peacebuilders in Asia and Pacific region.
Thank you, Paulo, for the introductions. First, I'd like to thank, of course, MPI for the opportunity, the staff, supporters of Clarity, built and nurtured this important space. I am not yet an alumni of MPI, although we've made many attempts in my early days of in the Peacebuilding when I transitioned from, well, not fully transitioned, but started in the Peacebuilding from activism. But I have been, I think, grown close to MPI and Chris in particular in the past 3 years since the coup in Myanmar. Especially since one of my co-founders of the Military Alliance, one of the last stages of the Military Alliance, is an alumna of MPI, a close friend. Unfortunately, last year has been detained and was convicted in prison due to her participation and leadership in the civil so let me start with telling more, I think, where my starting point is. My presentation is entitled, because the theme of MPI's program for this year is called Forging the Path Toward Peace and Journey Continues. And I want to add, I think, my analysis to what this means to me. And I titled this input as the Secularization and Militarism, Harnessing Solidarity and Feminist Reimagining. And I want to explain why this is my summation of what is the path ahead. While I'm currently housed in the past 9 years with a regional peacebuilding organization based here in Davao, throughout the past years I have also been deeply involved in various organizing and movement building initiatives in the Philippines and the region. I continue to trace my roots with the student and youth organizing, where I started when I was in university and when I first been involved in coalition building among progressive groups, different sectoral groups around economic, gender, and climate justice issues. In the wake of the attempted coup in Myanmar in 2021, we co-founded one of the most active backstage of the Military Alliance. It's a loosely structured, non-hierarchical, and distributed pan-Asian network of young activist collectives, protest organizers, and peace advocates who are resisting together against autocratic and militarist rule and against state violence and oppression in the region. Although the origins of the Military Alliance came from a hashtag, which basically in the digital space in Twitter, its action has transcended to offline activism and embedded itself in existing on-ground organizations. So some of our initiatives in the past 3 years have mostly been in social media and online because there isn't, due to lockdowns and limitations as well of travel, that's the best that most of us and all of us could do. But we also went out to protest when we can and where we can during the pandemic. And many of our members across the regions, spanning from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, Myanmar, going even farther to India and Iran, have done their own independent initiatives where they can. And this is where I wish to start with my input. From the point of view of one who stands in the intersection and tensions of two interlinked but often pitted strategies of peacebuilding and mediation on one hand, and activism and resistance on the other. This is how I wish to answer the question of what are the critical issues on peace and as peace builders we are facing in Asia Pacific, particularly in our generation. We are facing enormous challenges, which is not quite new to all of us. The repercussions of the global pandemic, which has not only exposed but also exacerbated deep social inequalities within countries and between well-off nations in the global south. We are also faced with the backsliding of democratic institutions and values and the rise of authoritarianism, repression, and impunity in many countries, especially in Asia. The continuing armed conflicts and violence across the regions such as Myanmar, South Thailand, the Philippines, and beyond such as in Sudan, Armenia, Yemen, Ukraine, among others, has contributed to a deteriorating sense of peace and human security around the world. Among these challenges, two stands out as of utmost consequence for our generation and the future of humanity. The first one, the impending nuclear war, and the second one, climate change. At the core of these two fundamental problems that we are facing lies the question of collective decision-making, cooperation, and action on a global scale. Basically, a question of how can we as one humanity agree on and forge our collective path. And by global scale, I'm not only referring to international relations and geopolitics among our governments, although that platform is of utmost importance. When I speak of global scale, I also refer to those undoubtedly crucial in alluding to the various levels of and platforms where we deliberate together as community. How do we choose our leaders at the national, local, and community level? Which policies do we support? Which narratives and lives do we believe in and amplify? Which values guide our choices and relationships? Is it one fueled by fear and panic? Or is it one driven by empathy, integration, courage in each other, and trust that we can find and build solutions together? This question at its core is a peace-building question. So when we ask about the main hurdles we face in our path as peace builders, our answer goes beyond simply listing the problems. It also is about how we appreciate this set of problems and how we see ourselves in relation to those problems. There are two presenting challenges that I think we are uniquely positioned to address. The first challenge before us is the problem and the challenge of secularization and politics of fear. Securitization is the use of narratives around security, around what is it that we are afraid of, the threat and emergency that incites panic and cloud our better judgment as people, to sow division across society, to mobilize consent for autocratic governing and wars, to justify extraordinary measures that otherwise we couldn't have. And these are often framed in military or war narratives. So, in the Philippines, the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on COVID, eventually the war on climate. And the problem with this framing is, it's a question of war against who is the enemy. And often, since the narrative is dictated by our governments and our elites, then it is weighed against certain people in the margins. In general, increased war rhetoric means more arms and military spending at the expense of much needed investment to public and social spending, healthcare and social protection at the time of the global pandemic, to financing for climate solutions, climate adaptation mitigation, especially in the global south and most vulnerable countries in climate change, and to investment for peace building at a time of so much suffering and violence. Total global military expenditure passed the 2 trillion mark for the first time in 2021 during a pandemic, and rise to a new high in last year, according to CITI. This is the highest level since they tracked this since 1998. And this is driven by large increases of spending in Europe, Ukraine, and East Asia, by China, Japan, and India. The combined military expenditures of countries in Asia and Oceania was more than half of the global military expenditure of the world. And this was 2.7% more than in 2021 and 45% more than in 2013. In 2019, the World Economic Forum estimated the violent conflict cost the world around $14.4 trillion US, with 10% of the global GDP being spent on causing and then repairing the damage caused. Much of the cost is on military defense expenditure. At the same time, the World Bank estimates the violent conflict costs 80% of all humanitarian aid. And this is why I wish to talk about militarization. Militarization is not simply the visible rise of military rule. It often happens in its deeper meaning, permeates societal norms and discourses, manifesting in sometimes occurring when any part of society is controlled by the military or is dependent on military values. For instance, the dependence on military information and analysis and metrics of success to address the armed insurgency in the Philippines via the MPI, instead of tackling the root causes of conflicts such as inequality, corruption, abuse of power, discrimination of indigenous peoples. It also takes the form of use of punitive approaches and suspension of due processes and new normalization of killings to address drug addiction and the drug problem. It can also take the form of normalization of lockdown, surveillance, military presence to manage the pandemic, or the push for the return of mandatory military training as a route to supposedly capacitate the population around humanitarian response to disaster, and framing it as the only way to inculcate civic values among citizens, especially. In conclusion, around the first of the two challenges that I think we face in best places peace builders to address. To counter these trends, we need to imagine other meanings and paths of security and safety centered on feminist alternatives. And if you look at it, this is what peace building is about. This means challenging dominant understandings and meanings of what security is. Challenging security as a part of war rhetoric when government apply this to all societal problems and supposedly when those problems should not merely be seen as from the lens of war. Security only in terms of negative peace and direct violence rather than positive peace and other forms of violence as cultural and structural. Challenging the conceptions of security that is determined from above by the political elite and by the state, and challenging security only for those in the center and for the few. This means, for us peace builders, finding and peace building rights-respecting alternatives, better and grounded stories that reflect realities of what drives insecurity among, especially those who are at the margins and those who are. We don't have to go far when we talk about reimagining. There are a lot of reimagining already happening in practice. In Mindanao, a lot of you are already doing that in practice. The concept of usay among friends and peers in the Lumanos, a way of mediating conflict and building consensus across communities to identify the sources of threats, their ideas, and their solutions. kakabulunan, a shared term of the Baleinakorodawa, which means to revisit boundaries. And in their case, it's not simply about revisiting boundaries as a point of division, but boundaries as a point of coming together, passing on centuries-old peace pacts from elders to younger generations of morals and demands in the Batac. The other fundamental challenge that we face that peace builders are well placed to address is the fundamental challenge of despair among our communities and people's movements, which has clouded our vision of what else is possible and clipped our creativity to find and build solutions. As an organizer for more than a decade, I have no doubts that the people's movements in our communities can find and build creative solutions. Our communities have endured worse and many things in the past decades and centuries. However, my hypothesis is, and speaking for Southeast Asia and East Asia, in the past 3 years specifically, our movements, both regionally and nationally, are more than ever overwhelmed with hopelessness, with isolation, with exhaustion, polarization, and fragmentation. So the question for us is, where is the space for care within our movements? What does care look like, which departs from consumers and individual concepts of care? I think we have to reclaim spaces for collective care and solidarity, to rediscover our sense of adventure and joy and hope. Remember when we first all started with activism and peacebuilding, that sense of adventure, that it's okay to make mistakes. Unfortunately, I think with how programming aid has designed this, we are afraid to make mistakes. We have to figure it out. What's our action plan in the next 5 years or 10 years? Who could possibly know what we could possibly do in the next 5 years and 10 years? And the problem with that is it clips the activity of CSOs, of our communities and our movements. At a time when our states sought to look inward and isolate themselves from each other during the pandemic, many of us have sought solidarity and connection with each other. For example, the emergence of community platforms of mutual aid in the Philippines during the pandemic, inspired by the Baleinakorodawa community fund. There is another project that I have been involved with, organizing urban mothers and grandmothers and women and peer folks in one of the community families. Another example is the virtual-based helpline survivor-centered care space called Luna's Collective, supporting those experiencing gender-based violence and concerned with reproductive health during the lockdowns, when women cannot seek out the help of other women because of lockdowns. When we cannot look for help on gender and sexual violence because we are stuck with those that causes us this violence. And that also includes the MPI Alliance Backstage that we co-founded, a space where we seek to make sure that the hashtag does not regress into being a simple hashtag, but progress into an actual living community of activists working together. A space that seeks to reconnect emerging youth activists, politicized online, and linking them to us who have already been organizing in the ground. A space to seek to follow through and reflect on certain questions, doubt, and desire for learning. But more than that, a space for us to be seen by fellow activists. At times, we simply hang out, play games, dance. Sometimes we just watch documentaries and even play some computer games. Laugh together, even cry together. This too, the task of reimagining feminist alternatives to militarism macho conceptions of security and safety. And the others, the rebuilding of spaces for collective care and solidarity and creativity, are areas that these builders are already working on. And we have long experience. Unfortunately, and this is a criticism of someone, a self-criticism of someone who have also been involved at least just for a decade. We tend to also be parochial in our peace work. Okay, we are already done with the Bangsamoro, we will not mind the GRP and PNP. Or if if we deal with South Thailand, then okay, we will mind this as what is it for us next time. I think we have to find our greatest silos and see that how we identify as peace builders or as activists or a human rights defender or a human rights actor are more artificial than real. In fact, with our communities, they do not splice in that this issue is simply a human rights issue. And there is, I think, a challenge for us an invitation to you, my fellow peace builders. I think our peers in the human rights defenders movement, our fellow activists who sometimes we think to be hard-headed and more militant than ours, need our help. They need us to provide them and problematize with them the tools of how we apply peace building and how to manage fragmentation within movements. They need us to carve out space for care because they are faced so much with suffering in the face of autocracies and militarism and violence. Despite my and our resolve, and this is my concluding part, we also grapple in the activist movement with profound questions and confront a lot of tensions. What is our critique and diagnosis of the broader political and economic structures, and what do we want to replace them that way? We are good at protesting. Unfortunately, we struggle with building, to be being honest, with finding alternatives. And that has something to do with our positionality as well, to be forced to take the path of violence. What are the possibilities in the intersection of peace building and resistance and movement building? How can we apply peace building tools to address inter-movement conflict and fragmentation and to support consensus and coalition building? How can peace building tools better reach the public and bridge divide in the in instances of deep polarization in societal conditions? And how can we apply those tools to problematize and see this and prevent seeding the same culture of militarism and violence in post-revolution settings, such as Myanmar? How can we harness the concept and experimentations of deliberative democracy as a way to address disinformation and navigate polarization in society? And ultimately, how do we reclaim our successes amidst many failures to fully birth our ideas in a system that is not yet ready for them? To a huge extent, peace building is the same way. It's a time capsule from the future. A lot of our ideas is not because they're wrong, it's because the current system is not prepared for it. But how do we keep the track and celebrate that and see that? How do we translate this abstraction into critical practice? I will not sugarcoat our challenges and are existential, and we have immense tasks ahead. Saying we should do this together is easy to say, but it is extremely difficult in practice. It means challenging our dominant structures, especially our economic systems, built on extraction, consumption, and division. It means some of us will have to give up some power to make space for others, especially for those in the margins. It means some of us need to give up immense profits so everyone will have enough. It also means challenging our own orthodoxy in our respective fields, whether we refer to it in the peace building, or humanitarian, or human rights field, so that we could all implement. There is no definite path to our complex problems. The uncertainty is unnerving, but it's also an opportunity to reimagine and reinvent. My hypothesis is, as long as we show up for each other, and as long as each day we choose to aspire and hope, and carve out spaces where we could find those oases to renew that sense of adventure and hope, there will be room for solutions and progress. As an activist, my mantra is, the more we show up and take action, the clearer the path will become. in the end, I wish us all endurance, and I wish us all solidarity and courage. Thank you, and thank you for
Thank you very much, Marc. I'm sure we can all agree that while Marc has outlined the many challenges that peacebuilders face in Asia and the Pacific, he has pointed to two major challenges, which are secularization and militarism. That's something that we need to pay attention to as peacebuilders. Might not be, and he says it's not just about the physical representation of militarism and all that. It's a lot of it is what's actually behind what we see, which are more structural in nature, and something that we really need to be considering as peacebuilders in our discussions. Particularly in the coming week and the weeks the weeks ahead of us. I also like the fact that he's attested to the fact that we need to find innovative ways that are relevant and culturally appropriate in the Pacific to begin to address these critical issues that we face, and he has outlined for us this morning, particularly in challenging the dominant structures that cause the challenges that we have. I think his questions right at the end is enough to even create a course for MPI. And we can spend one whole week and maybe even more than that to begin to answer some of those questions that I think for us as peacebuilders need to be focusing on in our work in peacebuilding. So I'd like to thank Marc again for this, for that very interesting, challenging, but also helpful insight into the critical issues that we face as peacebuilders in Asia and the Pacific. Let's please